Hello and welcome to Have Trowel, Will Travel, a bi-monthly podcast where we sit down for a virtual fireside chat with archaeologists, anthropologists, and historians about their studies, experiences, and whatever interesting topic comes to mind. I'm Bridget, host and auditor of the Archaeology Society here at NUIG. For this episode, I had the absolute pleasure of chatting with Dr. Marie Prentiss, an archaeologist from Montana who's been excavating in Bridge River, British Columbia, about her work there and her experience working alongside the descendant community. So sit back wherever you might be tuning in and enjoy. I'm here with Dr. Marie Prentiss, who has graciously offered to talk to us today about her work. And we're super excited. I'm really excited because I've just been reading a little bit of your biography and some of the things that you've done, and I find it really interesting. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say. So I'll turn it over to you if you just want to kind of tell us a little bit about yourself and about what you study.
Okay. Well, I'm Marie Prentiss. I'm a Regents Professor of Anthropology at the University of Montana. I'm an archaeologist, and my research is focused on the study of what we call complex fisher hunter-gatherers and the rise of villages and social, economic, political, and demographic change in those villages. I am also interested in evolutionary theory and using phylogenetic approaches to understanding long-term history. In terms of field research, most of my work in the last 20 years has been focused on a particular village in interior British Columbia called the Bridge River site. And I work with a First Nation group called Hoishten, or the Bridge River Indian Band. And we study the long-term history of this house pit village. So there's kind of a broad introduction to me.
No, that's really neat. I think one thing that particularly sparked my interest when I was kind of looking through your stuff is you working with the First Nations. That's something that, while we don't necessarily have in Ireland, we've kind of talked about it a little bit in some of our classes. But we'll get to that a little later. I don't want to jump the gun too much. So you mentioned you look a lot into the fisher hunter gatherer societies. Might be a bit self-explanatory what the name is, but could you kind of tell us a little bit more about what fisher hunter gatherer society
Sure.
versus just hunter gatherer society, because that's
Right.
usually the term that we use.
Right. Well, increasingly we've been making a distinction between fisher hunter-gatherers and just straight hunter-gatherers, mainly on the basis of folks who are reliant for a large proportion of their diet on marine resources. And that could be anadromous fish like salmon, which is the case with the folks I work with, or folks who live on the coast who have a broader diet based on fishing. These societies are, I suppose they're probably similar to those of the late Mesolithic coastal Northern Europe.
Yeah, probably. I know they've done at least when we would be learning about the Mesolithic societies here, fishing was a big part of their society and of their diet. So that we probably could call them fisher hunter-gatherers rather than just straight up hunter-gatherers, because they mostly lived along the coast, and a lot of the settlements that we found are, well, now they're underwater because the sea has risen since the Mesolithic, but they would have been right on the coastline.
Right. And one thing that makes these folks different, given this intense reliance on fishing, is it's also very storage oriented. With the middle Fraser Canyon folks, the salmon come in July and they're done by early September, and they have to put up enough stored fish along with some other resources to get by from basically November to March when it's cold and everything's frozen.
Wow, I was trying to count those. So July, August, September.
Well, the way they're, sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna say that's really only 3 months to try to collect enough food to get you through the
Right.
winter.
Well, it's a complex warm season cycle where fishing starts in July with the actually no, not there's fishing that starts actually in May, but that's just the odd, really big king salmon coming up the river. The really intense fishing, which is for the sockeye salmon, starts in mid-July and into August, and that's what they really rely on is the July-August fishing. But
Okay.
then what they'll do is they'll dry all the fish because it's really hot there in the summer, cold in the winter and hot in the summer, and then store that away, and then go up into the mountains deer hunting and root gathering and trout fishing and doing a whole bunch of other things between September and November. And then by about late November, it's snow and cold, and they're moving back into the winter villages and making use of all that salmon they'd stored away, as well as everything they'd gathered in the fall after salmon season ended, which would be dried deer and elk or wapiti, uh, bark, moss, dried trout, berries, a whole bunch of things.
That's a really complex just dietary system where there's just all these little bits and pieces coming in to help get them through.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is their system of storage, where a lot of the foods would be saved in pits or in raised buildings away from the village. And these pits would be really deep. They might be a couple of meters deep, and then just sealed in vegetation and earth. And then so that everything remains dry, and then in the winter frozen. And so if they've got a lot of food stored, that means they've got these storage pits scattered around on the landscape that they then hit in the winter and bring it into the village and put it in storage pits in the houses.
Wow, that
Yeah.
is
And so they're
really, really
constantly moving
neat.
frozen goods from these field sites to the village sites for short-term storage and consumption.
Yeah. Now, the concept of storage, especially like before things like refrigeration, is always fascinated me because it's always just something. It's so interesting to think about, um, how people would have stored food before refrigerators. Now, why might they have these storage pits and places outside of the village instead of in it or near it?
Mhm. Well, they did both. There would be some outdoor storage in and around the houses. We see those. But a lot were away from the village. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is just protection from raiding. If the
Ah,
village got raided for the purpose of stealing food mostly, then there wouldn't be much to take if it was scattered about in secret places at the
okay.
fishing sites and the hunting sites and elsewhere, root gathering places. It'd be harder to take. Another reason would be is if you had just a crisis of some kind and you lost it here, you've got backup over there.
Okay.
Yeah. And
That
so
makes
all of this
sense
is
too.
it's constant sort of risk management when your winter survival is predicated on those stored food items.
Yeah. That's really, I guess, sophisticated. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
which I don't like using that word to talk about ancient peoples because, there's always this thought of ancient peoples being somewhat primitive compared to modern, but then you start really looking at it and it turns out that they had this whole system to make sure that they could have enough food in case they got attacked, in case something happened to one storage bit. I mean, it's fascinating that they put
Yeah,
that much thought into it.
absolutely. Well, and I
Huh.
haven't even talked about the spring system where they would come out of the winter houses in early March, sometime around there, late February, and then everything was geared towards basically people being real hungry, just immediate getting some food, fresh food in March, April. But then they would be in sort of back up into the intermediate elevations for deer hunting and root gathering, and a lot of that food would be brought down to the fishing camps for storage and consumption while they were fishing in July. with the fishing going towards the winter survival. So everything is segmented.
Yeah.
Spring hunting and gathering oriented towards summer consumption, and then summer fishing, hunting, gathering, and fall hunting, gathering oriented towards winter survival.
Wow. They really had just a whole system for getting all this figured out, getting everything squared away, and that is so cool. It kind of makes me wonder if the Mesolithic people here had something similar. I'm not too familiar with Britain, but at least like in Ireland, we have a problem with there's really not a lot of Mesolithic um, evidence available because it's all underwater.
Right.
Because at the time of the Mesolithic, the interior of Ireland was so thickly forested, we don't have a whole lot of activity there. So everybody was kind of on the coasts. But then the water started coming up. They started moving in, so all of our stuff is underwater. So it'd be fantastic to see if we could take a look at that and see what kind of systems they had in place for this kind of survival.
Sure.
Just
Well,
so
you
cool.
also have this wonderful Neolithic record as well.
We do.
And the village issues and storage issues in the Neolithic are also very similar to these village-based fisher hunter-gatherers in northwestern North America.
Yeah. So for some of these villages, so it sounds like from the fact that they are keeping their food kind of stored in these different places in case if the village gets attacked and gets raided of all their food. Did they build their villages to have any kind of defensive capabilities, or were they kind of too temporary to do too much with that, or like how were the villages kind of set up?
Okay, that's a good question. We know from the historical record that sometimes villages were fortified, but we've never found any evidence archaeologically. And some of these villages are enormous. The Bridge River site where I work has 80 houses, and many of which are, well, they're all bigger than 10 meters in diameter, and many are 15 to 20 meters in diameter. Many of these houses are very long lived, so not just a single generation. The house where I've been working actually on one house since 2012 has 17 generational floors.
Wow.
And so for a period of, for 15 of those floors was consecutive occupation, about 24 years each. So about 350 years was continuous rebuilding and reoccupation, generation after generation, building up floor after floor after floor. So these are long-lived places. It's almost like a Middle Eastern tell. There's so much cultural
Yeah.
material built up within and between all these houses. There's at least 3 meters of just continuously built up cultural material there. Anyway, so the issue of defense. So we haven't found walls. We haven't found fortifications, but there's a couple of things that sort of stand out. First of all, these villages are on these flat promontories, basically on terraces in these steep canyons.
Okay.
And so basically wherever there's a goodly flat place, there's a village.
Fair enough.
What I call a vertical landscape.
Fair enough.
Just
Actually, I
mountains
looked up.
everywhere.
Sorry, I looked up Bridge River just on Google Maps, and I was kind of just exploring around the area, and it's quite hilly.
Yeah, it is. And so these big villages would, because there'd be so many people living in these places, that would kind of be their defense right there. They might have hundreds to even over 1,000 or more people living in one of these villages.
Wow.
Yeah, and that would be in and of itself some sense of protection, just having a lot of people. But then there's a fascinating debate between the elders of the contemporary Native people. When we did, my colleague Ian Kite and I put out a book called People of the Middle Fraser Canyon back in 2012. And as part of doing the book was working with an artist to recreate what it might have looked like in those villages. And we worked with some elders to sort of flesh out things that we couldn't see in the archaeological record. And one of the questions that we had was, well, were the villages kind of hidden in the trees, or did they make sure the trees were cut back so that you could see who's coming?
Yeah.
And one elder told us, oh, they always cut it back. And the other elder said, no, 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 they always hid in the trees. So
Oh,
in our drawings in the book, we put it intermediate, which is probably wrong on either count, but we didn't know what else to do.
oh gosh, I can just imagine that. Oh
But
wow.
they tell us that there are lookout sites
Mm-hmm.
in the canyons up above the villages where people would have temporary shelters, and in times where they were concerned about raids, they would have lookouts posted so they could see up and down the valleys. Yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting. Because again, I'm just kind of comparing it to what I know here of Ireland, and that we have quite a long history of defensive sites. Although for a large part of Irish history, because they were very much based in cattle, um, their defense was you could just round up the cows and disappear into the bog, and the English couldn't get you. Um, but we do have quite a few defensive sites and they tend to be quite large, because with the idea being you could stick your cattle in there and protect them from wolves or other animals or other people coming in to try to steal it. So it's interesting to see these kind of different answers to how to protect yourself from enemies. Now, was there a lot of conflict in this area, or was it kind of don't want to necessarily say peaceful, but like what was the nature of
Yeah.
conflict in this period?
Well, it's really interesting. In the middle Fraser Canyon, uh, the fishery in the Fraser River there is, even today, is the best salmon fishery in interior British Columbia. There, it just produces literally millions of fish um, in a good year, and so the people the people aggregated there in large numbers, and there was not a lot of payoff for them in waging war
Yeah.
with the neighbors, even though they joke about that now. Uh, uh, but really, their payoff was in exchange, in trade, because the Middle Fraser dried salmon was so good. It still is so good, if you like that kind of thing. Um, that even the folks on the coast who had tons of smoked fish would trade to get the mid-Fraser wind-dried salmon. And then they also had, beyond the salmon, they had kind of a really great access, particularly in the Bridge River Valley, to nephrite jade and soapstone or
Ah,
steatite. And so they were a major producer of nephrite jade adzes for woodworking, and steatite bowls and beads and pendants. And so between the salmon and the stone resources, uh, they were able to sort of monopolize the trade in certain things. Also, they produced weavings from goat hair, wild mountain goat hair, and dog hair,
interesting.
and that was a trade item too. And so we almost never see any indicators of violence in the record of these villages. Now, historically, there was a period in and around the early fur trade, the early 19th century, where everything got destabilized for a while, to some degree, amongst the Statliam, or the folks of the Mid-Fraser, and their neighbors, the in the Kapamuk people or Thompson people. And there's a lot of violence for a few decades, but it doesn't look like that was the norm in
Okay.
earlier times.
Ah, that's interesting. I looked up a picture of nephrite jade here. It's very pretty.
It's
Some very nice
gorgeous.
green to it. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and it's so tough. If you need a stone tool to do woodworking, that's kind of what you want. Of
Oh.
course, it would take a long time to make one of those things.
Yeah.
There was a master's thesis done at Simon Fraser University where the graduate student made an ads for his thesis, among other things he did
Oh
for his thesis.
wow.
And it took him 100 hours of watching football on TV to grind this thing out.
Oh my gosh. Wow. So did they end up doing any polishing on these finished
Mhm.
products?
Yep,
Okay.
highly polished. Yeah,
Wow.
you would saw it loose from a block, and then you would just have to grind it into shape and then polish it. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I bet that would make a very nice object. Anything that's made of. I do love me some good stones.
I've got one. Here's a this is a miniature of one of these.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
That is gorgeous.
yeah.
Wow.
Oh gosh. Here's a rough out. Oh, let's see, there we go. It's
Oh.
been sawed on one side here,
Mm-hmm.
and then there you can see the lovely jade, and then there's
Yeah.
the rough exterior.
Wow.
Yeah.
That is so cool. I know that's interesting because so we found a couple. I think it's mostly been in the UK where we found these jadeite axe heads that have been traced all the way to the Alps.
Right.
And it
Yep, I've read
seems,
about those.
yeah, really, really cool. And the lady who's done a lot of work on it, Alison Sheridan, she came and talked to the society about 4 years ago, and super, super cool. Um,
I know
and it's,
Allison.
oh, do you?
Yes.
She's a lovely lady.
Yes.
And she's talking about how they were such important items because they traveled so far and they were just such high quality, such, to get some of the polished uh, state to them. It would take ages and ages just to get to that. And I guess they didn't have football to watch to try to keep them occupied as they were making it. Oh gosh. Yeah. So I probably should have started with this, but I just got really excited and got right into it. So what time period are you looking at?
The time period that we have been mostly focused on is the period in the interior where you start to see these large villages, and that has just under 2,000 years ago. So the big villages in the mid-Fraser area, the Bridge River site, the Keatley Creek site, the Bell site, and a few others, all date, their most intense occupations are between about 1,000 years ago and about 16 to 1,800 years ago.
Okay, so we're
And
yeah, so we're talking about the turnover from BC to AD, if I'm doing
just a
my
little,
math correctly.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. So in calendar terms, the Bridge River site was initiated at about 200 AD,
Okay.
and then it grew steadily. It hit peak size at about 800 to 700 to 800 AD,
Hmm.
and then then was abandoned more or less at about 1,000, and then repopulated in the last 500 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Is there any particular reason why it kind of went through that pause of population?
Yeah, it coincides actually with the medieval climatic anomaly, and
Ah.
which
Okay.
was great if you're a Viking wanting to be a farmer in Greenland,
Yeah.
and it was lousy if you were a salmon fisher person,
Oh
because
yeah.
the warmer conditions meant high sea surface temperatures, which is not so great for small fish, which feeds salmon. It's also not so great for forest health, and if your forest is having fires and eroding into the creeks, that means cloudy water, which is no good for salmon
Hmm.
spawning.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so the last warming period was not very good for these villages. And then if your salmon runs aren't very good, then you overeat your deer and your small game, and maybe you overharvest your root resources, and so that's a problem too. And so that seemed to have happened throughout the villages at around beginning probably around 1,200 years ago, and then the the full on abandonment of the big villages at about 1,000 years ago. Now the people still were there. They seem to have scattered. They probably were reduced in numbers, but we're doing a new study of the radiocarbon record right now, and it kind of, the modeling kind of shows that there was a low population still there
Yeah.
throughout the time between 1,000 and 500 years ago, before the villages sort of perked up again and got big again.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting to hear just how interconnected everything is. You know, something that was great for the Vikings had such a devastating effect for the people here, and not only that, but just because we've talked about, like, you know, the medieval warming event, um, but it's fascinating. I keep saying that, but it really is, just to hear how something as small as, you know, if the forests are not doing too well and they're eroding, you know, it's eroding into the water and it's causing the water quality to go down, and now your salmon is being affected, and just all these tiny little things that are all affecting each other, and then it results in that these people are, you know, population is dropping off, or maybe they're dispersing, and then we see it in the archaeological record.
Absolutely. And you know, the Little Ice Age came, you know, in the last 500-600 years, up to about 150 years ago. And those cold, wet summers were terrible if you're farming in Northern Europe.
Yes.
And they were quite good for salmon.
Oh gosh, we can't just have a win-win scenario. That's so funny because, again, it's something else that we've talked about where it caused one of many famines in Ireland. Um, Everybody likes to talk about the Great Famine of 45, but Ireland has basically been in a constant state of famine for the past 2,000 years or so. But it's interesting to hear that while it kind of sucked for Northern Europe, it was great for everybody over in British Columbia.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. That's also, it's interesting to hear that because, um, like in our archaeology classes, even our history classes, really in the college, we tend to kind of focus on Ireland and maybe a bit of the continent, a little bit of Britain as well. We don't get a whole lot of, well, your side of the pond.
Sure.
Yeah, although as you could probably tell by my accent, I am not Irish myself. I just ended up over there, and so I've kind of gotten a little bit of each world, but I
Uh-huh.
want to kind of help give our members a bit of a perspective on things that were going on over in the Americas. And so this is really neat to hear, especially since, you know, it's kind of mentioning things that we've hit in our classes and go, oh, that's what's going on.
Hmm.
Yeah, so that's really
Great.
cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. So so these ancient peoples who were living in this area, are they the ancestors to the Bridge River people who are there now?
Hmm.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Um, the people now are Salish speakers. They the indigenous Mid-Fraser folks are called Statlium, and they're
Stunning.
broken up into multiple bands. And Hoiston is the Bridge River Indian band, the one that are direct descendants of the Bridge River archaeological site.
Okay.
Yeah,
That's cool that there's such a
of the
long continuation.
and there is, yeah. I mean, there is this few hundred years, around 1,000 years ago to about 500 years ago, where the record is kind of hard to follow. But what's really interesting is if you look at the material culture in terms of the styles of tools and the raw materials and the way houses are built and what's going on after 500 years ago, it's exactly the same. Um, in the our project at House Bit 54 at Bridge River, the 17-floor house, shows that really well. The final floor was actually late fur trade period. It was literally mid 19th century.
Wow.
Yeah, we were able to show that they actually had trade beads made in Venice in 1851, and then
Wow.
they made it to the floor of this house. And so, assuming it took at least a year for the bead to get
Yeah.
all the way from Venice to interior British Columbia, then maybe that house was in use minimally in 1852 AD. And then we know it went out of use in 1858 because that's when the gold rush happened, and 10,000 gold miners flooded the area and drove everybody out of living in pit houses.
Yeah.
It was sort of a dark period. And but anyway, so we were able to compare this fur trade floor that had 12,000 lithic artifacts on it with the 1,000-year earlier floors, and the styles of arrow points and scrapers and woodworking tools, bone tools, bone awls, everything was was identical.
Wow. That is just
Yeah,
fantastic.
yeah. So it's very, very clear that it's the same people. They dispersed a bit on the landscape for a few hundred years, didn't live in the aggregated villages while the fisheries were sketchy. And then when the fishing got better in the Little Ice Age,
Yeah.
they packed back in, and that's where they lived. And that's where they were when the first Europeans showed up in British Columbia.
Wow, that's such a neat uh, kind of look into how they've, just the story of the landscape, the story of the people there, and just how they've managed to survive for thousands of years through,
Mm-hmm.
hardship and whatever. And we're able to see that into all these layers. It's really cool just to think of those trading beads that came all the way from Venice, and to just kind of
Mm-hmm.
imagine the journey they would have gone through to go from Venice to this, to this little house here.
Right. Well, what's really interesting is that particular kind of bead. It's a white, green, and red striped bead, and most of those beads ended up in Africa.
Interesting.
Yeah, and but apparently a small number of them made their way into the Americas and
Yeah.
all the way to the War of House Bid 54 at Bridge River.
That is really neat. It kind of makes me wonder what kind of trading connections they would have had,
Mhm.
if not directly with Europeans, then maybe with some other people who then connected with the Europeans, who then brought it
Sure.
back. Or
There were fur trade posts about 100 kilometers to there's one to the east and another about 60, 70 kilometers to the south.
okay,
And yeah, and so and given that salmon was always in demand, but by the 1850s, the deer, I mean the beaver trade had collapsed. They basically hunted out most of the beaver, and so deer hides were the big thing
yeah,
in the 1840s and 1850s before gold became the big thing. And so we have evidence at Bridge River from House Pit 54 that they had kind of a deer product, a hide factory in the house, because we found
huh,
uh, in just one floor there were 250 big hide scrapers,
wow,
and 135 arrow points, and probably somewhere 5 to 8,000 pieces of burnt rock in a midden in the middle of the floor, which was used to boil water for grease extraction, which was used to tan the hides.
there's quite a lot of activity going on in just this one house.
So this one house probably had two families
Yeah.
uh, raising their kids and, caring for their elders, but also very engaged in production of goods for exchange. We also found 3 spindle whorls for making yarn, which
Oh,
supported this idea that they were making blankets for trade out of dog hair and goat hair.
wow, that's really cool. So how big is this house?
This house is 13 meters in diameter.
Okay, so it's a round house.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay, it's a
yeah.
sizable
Though
house.
earlier in its lifespan, for a while, for about 7 floors, it was a rectangle before it doubled
Interesting.
in size. Yeah.
And why might they have changed from using a rectangle to a roundhouse structure?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's a population issue because at around 1,300 years ago, there was this boom in population. So uh, there, I think there was a real boom in salmon productivity. It kind of correlates with some indicators from the coast that marine productivity temporarily spiked. That meant that the fishery was really good in the mid-Fraser, and so there was kind of a salmon rush where people packed into these villages, and they'd already been there, but just the numbers really skyrocketed. And so not only does the village grow really fast in terms of numbers of houses, but the one house that we've studied in intense detail doubled in size right at that same time.
Wow. That's it's just so cool to think about. Yeah, so when the Europeans came, now because my knowledge of history in this area is hazy at best, but was it the French who first came to this area, or was it the English?
It was English.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. The first person to explore the Middle Fraser Canyon, it was in 1808 when Simon Fraser
Ah.
made the famous run down the Fraser River and documented the native people. Of course, the native people at that point already knew of Europeans because they'd been visiting the coast for a while.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so it wasn't a shock to see Europeans coming through. But Simon Fraser's, and he was a Scotsman, working for the Northwest Company, was the first one to run through the area.
Okay. Yeah, it occurred to me almost immediately after I asked the question that we're talking about British Columbia, not like Quebec.
Right,
I was thinking
right.
that could have answered it, but then again, my knowledge of this area is very, very hazy.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, so yeah, that's interesting. So trying to think, I'm looking at I keep looking at the map here, just kind of trying to orient myself of where it
Mm-hmm.
is. Um, so then at the time of kind of like the fur trade was going on, and then later it's collapsed. So all this area was under control of the British.
More or less, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Oh, I see it. Okay, I just zoomed out a little bit. Okay, so you're over by Vancouver. My knowledge
Uh-huh.
of geography of Canada is even.
Yeah, we're the area where I work is around Lillooet, British Columbia.
Okay.
If you find Lillooet, you'll see the sort of S-shaped curve in the river,
Yeah.
and the Bridge River's branching off from there, just north of Lillooet. So Lillooet's about 4 hours by vehicle northeast of Vancouver.
Oh, wow. I always forget just how big Canada is until I see a map or something and I go, whew. Especially since I've been in Ireland for like the past 4 years, and it's quite small.
Yeah, right.
4 years and I would, or sorry, 4 hours and I would be in the ocean if I were driving. Oh gosh. So this is all just it's a fascinating study that you have going on here, and I could probably talk to you for hours on end about it because I just find it really, really cool. But as I kind of mentioned before, really interested to hear about your work with the Bridge River Indian Band.
Uh-huh.
I went and I spent most of yesterday. I was looking at the different names they go by, and I was just had like a little phonology chart of the language, and I went, oh dear, I can't pronounce any of that. So I am just.
Well, if you weren't raised speaking Salish, there's a lot of sounds you just can't make. I can't make.
They had
Yeah.
some fascinating sounds that I just liked hearing, but I'm like, I struggle with English most days. I can't handle anything else. So so how did you come in contact with them? Did you go into your project with the idea that you wanted to work with them, or did that kind of come later?
Well, how it worked out was I did graduate school at Simon Fraser University in British Columbia, and I was part of one of my professor's projects at the Keatley Creek site. So I was part of Brian Hayden's team at Keatley, and Brian was working with the Squilix people who are part of the Statlium, and so I became familiar with the area, and I got to know a couple of the Squilix people, including their recently passed away senior elder, and so in about 1998, I was here at Montana, and wanted to start a new project. And so the first place I worked was actually back at Keatley Creek, which is a village about 10 kilometers from the Bridge River site. And we worked with the Squilic band and for a few years. And we realized that we really needed to work at another village and test some of the ideas that we had coming out of the other one, because and do some things a different way from the very start. And so I met with the Houston folks, the Bridge River folks, in 2002, and talked to them about would they be interested in collaborating in a partnership on a long-term project at the Bridge River site. And they were very enthusiastic. And so for ever since then, so now we have a 17-year running project with those guys, and it's been a great relationship. We've got some old friendships now, and the way we work is we collectively come up with ideas of things we want to study. If I have a sort of a big idea, the first thing I do is I'll go to the leadership in the band and say, hey, I have this idea, it's something we could do, and this is what we would learn from it, and then they'll talk about it and decide if they think it's a good idea too. And I won't do anything unless they think it's a super good idea.
Okay.
And so that's kind of how we work. And then the way we've done the field work is I've done all the fundraising. All our work has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the Winter-Grin Foundation for Anthropological Research, mostly NSF and NEH. And so I bring this grant money and these crews and all this research there. The band has had some grant money over the years, sometimes to hire band members to dig with us when we've done excavations.
Okay.
And so in between 2012 and 2014, the band had hired membership as part of the excavation crews, which was great.
Yeah.
It's just great fun to have those guys out there working with us, and they're really knowledgeable about the area, and our students learn a lot from them, and they've learned something from us about the basics of archaeology.
Yeah.
And so that's been a really great thing. And then when it comes to the sort of the writing and the publication process, I tend to again run drafts of papers, or I'll run ideas about here's how I want to go in terms of how we pursue the research and get their input, and then any draft materials I'll send to them before it gets published, so that we can make sure that we're taking into account traditional knowledge and their perspectives as well. I'm trying to do more of that right now. One thing that's not happened very much is having co-authors with the band or folks from the band to co-author works with us. Mm-hmm. But I'm working with a young, just graduate from college in anthropology from Squilic, and her name's Alicia Edwards. And so Alicia and I have been collaborating on various projects. So for example, we wrote a paper on the burnt roof tradition in the mid-Fraser. It's a lot like the burnt house tradition in the early Neolithic of Greece in southeastern Europe.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so in the mid-Fraser, you get every house you excavate, the roof is collapsed and burnt, sitting on top of the floor or floors. And in House Bit 54, there are actually 7 roofs. And in the 15 floor sequence that predates 1100 years ago, there are 5 roofs. And the final major collapsed roof, but also 4 other roofs, but they aren't complete roofs, they're just partial burnt roofs. So what Alicia and I did was we asked questions to her contacts about ash-related rituals. And And there's a very vibrant tradition of using ash today in native rituals, whether it's smudging to purify or burning food and goods as offerings at the graveyard. Uh, and so we've had this weird situation with House Pit 54 where 4 of those deeply buried roofs are less than a quarter of the roof. And so what you get is basically an intact floor with everything abandoned on the floor. And then this burnt roof sitting on just a part of it, and then the whole thing covered by another floor. And so why just a partial burnt roof? Why not the whole thing? And we also discovered that the bones that were embedded into those burnt roof are really highly burned. They're all white and calcified, much more burnt than the bones on the floors. So there were literally bones sitting on that portion of that roof that burnt and allowed to collapse on that floor. So we argued that it was an example of renewal rituals, that the house is being renewed and they're burning up a part of the roof as a renewal ritual, letting that fall on the old floor, and then just burying the whole thing with a new floor. Whereas the final roof is all full of burnt beams and the whole thing is covering the last floor, and that was clearly a closing ritual, that the life of the house had ended and they collapsed and burnt the whole roof, not just a little piece of it, because it wasn't going to be recycled. Yeah. And so today, of course, they don't burn their roofs down anymore, but they certainly do ash-related rituals to do with sacred belief systems about purity and connections with the spirit world, etc.
Okay, that's such a neat little continuation of a tradition. You know, that's kind of adapted into the modern setting.
And I wouldn't have had that insight without working directly with the community.
Yeah.
And it's mutually informative, the work we do and the work that and the insight they provide.
Yeah, I guess that's a huge benefit of working with the people whose history and heritage that you're studying.
The descended community.
Yeah, and how that's something. So we have in our archaeology course in our final year, we have a class called Public Archaeology, where we kind of talk about community archaeology and some of the problems that archaeologists can run into where they're trying to look at sites, especially if there are still people, like modern communities, that have attachments to it. And I have a couple of professors who have done quite a few community archaeology projects in Ireland, particularly in association with like studying famine villages. And, because there's still, although quite a few people left Ireland during the famine, one way or another. It's how my family ended up in the States. But there's still quite a few people who live in the area who have roots going back, hundreds of years. And so they were working on surveying this one famine village, and they went in and talked to the community that lived with it, lived around there, to get some of that kind of input and to have them help out and to hear some of the stories that had been passed down from grandparents. And there's all these cool little nuggets of information that they find because they go and they talk to the people who've actually lived there. They know the site. It's such a cool thing.
It is so cool. Yeah. Are you familiar with Ian Kite's research project in Inishark and Inishbofin?
Yes, actually, he was one guy we wanted to come and have talk to us, but COVID happened.
Okay.
But I'll have to see
in the future.
Yeah, either in the future, I'll see if I can get him on a call like this.
There you go. Yeah.
I've been to Inishbofin myself, and it is a gorgeous little island.
But I understand. I've never been there. I would love to visit sometime.
Yeah. Oh, it's wonderful, and it's actually, I would prefer it over like the Aran Islands, which are just off the coast of Galway, because it has the same kind of feel to it, but Inishbofin is much less commercialized, so it's a lot quieter, and you miss a lot of just the crazy tourist crowds. So it's absolutely gorgeous. But I was also thinking, as you're kind of telling me about you working with the um, Bridge River Indian Band. I just completely blanked on their name for a second.
Uh-huh.
But how cool would it be to be helping on a project in a spot where your ancestors have been? And like to know
Absolutely.
like this is where your ancestors, you're standing in the same spot that your great, however many time great grandparents stood. And
Absolutely.
that is so
Yeah.
neat.
Well, one thing that we also try to do is make sure that we uh, are aware of cultural protocols
Hmm.
for where we work. So one thing that happens every time I take a new crew to the Mid-Fraser, we have a ceremony with their spiritual leader in the community, and he
Okay.
smudges all of us and introduces us to the ancestors.
Oh, how neat.
Because the ancestors are still there,
Yeah.
and so they want us to make sure that we're not a shock to the ancestors and vice versa. So
Yeah.
we're all smudged and introduced, and we say our names, and Carl then talks to the ancestors in their language, and so we do that,
That's such a nice little
and
touch.
it is, and then we observe other protocols. If we find human remains, um, the protocol is that we can describe, we can photograph and describe and draw them in the field, and then but then they get turned over to the leadership of the band to be dealt with appropriate cultural protocols.
Okay. That
Yeah,
was going to be something that I wanted to ask about because I know that's kind of been a bit of contention between
hmm,
archaeologists and descendant communities
right.
and in many places, not just in the Americas, but kind of all
Oh,
over the
sure.
world.
Yeah.
In that, what do how to handle human remains in in a in a respectful manner? Because I know in the
Yeah.
past that hasn't always been done.
Right, absolutely. And one way that we're kind of lucky is that the ancestors rarely buried their dead in the village.
Okay.
The human remains that have been found tend to be away from the village, which is not where we work, on the
Yeah.
hillsides and terraces elsewhere, and so it's very, very rare that we encounter human remains. Mostly just shed teeth,
Ah.
though we did find a little piece of a cranium just loose
Interesting.
on a floor. And my guess is some dog found it and dragged it into the house.
Oh gosh. I can distinctly imagine that happening. Just the other day, my dog here found a half dead pigeon in the backyard and brought it in to show us.
Yep,
Like, look at me, I'm a great hunter. And we're like, we know you didn't catch that. But yeah, but that's it's really it's so good to hear that there's such a good relationship between you and the descendant community, and that there's such a two-way relationship in terms of research and in terms of publishing things. And it just, especially since in our public archaeology class, we tend to hear a lot of kind of horror stories almost,
oh sure, yeah,
some of the bad things that have happened and some of the bad blood between archaeologists and descendant communities across the world. Because I know a lot of times some archaeologists um, can kind of come into a site like, I'm the expert, I'm going to tell you what to think, and not really take into account the people there. So
sure.
it's cool to hear that kind of
Hmm.
side of things.
Well, the Bridge River Band has given me a lot of leeway.
Yeah.
I don't, I've just been upfront. Here's some things I like to do, and they've tended to say, "Great, we'll all learn something from that too." So it's been a great experience so far. We have
Yeah.
a brand new grant. We're expecting, once COVID crisis ends, we have funding for 2 more years of field work.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh, and I guess it's got to be a benefit for everybody involved just to be able to kind of find out more about the site. And again, kind of like I mentioned before, just how cool it would be to be working on a site that your ancestors lived in. It'd be great to learn about what your ancestors were doing there. Um, Although I'm sure they have stories that have been passed down and traditions about what their ancestors got up to and kind of the land as well.
absolutely.
Yeah. That is super neat. I'm trying to think. I had a nice little list of questions. I was like, just in case I kind of needed to figure out how to guide the conversation, but it was just, I just got really excited. Got really into everything that you were saying. I can't think of anything else that I want to try to ask you, although honestly, I could just hear you talk about this for hours. It's such a neat thing, and it's so different from what I've learned in my archaeology classes. And really, sorry, continue.
Go ahead. I was going to say, one of the new things that one of the advantages of this long floor sequence at House Pit 54 is we're able to actually look in detail at sort of transmission, reproduction of household traditions across generations. Yeah, and so we've published on the development of social change, particularly inequality, and we published this new paper in the Journal of Anthropological Archaeology on the subsistence history and as related to population variation. But the new thing that we're working on is cultural transmission between floors.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a brand new paper that's just getting ready to go into review right now, where we show that there's this process of gradual change in the way people position their cooking features and their storage features from floor to floor to floor to floor. And it looks like, we asked the question, or posed the alternative hypotheses that, okay, one scenario is the house was just a shelter and families came willy-nilly, didn't really pass on traditions from generation to generation. It's just they sort of reinvented themselves each time. Versus this idea that the house was a capital H house in the Levi-Straussian sense, person morale, and that all these traditions were passed on, inherited across multiple generations. And if that was the case, we should see only very gradual change from floor to floor. And as it turns out, that's exactly what we see.
Okay.
There's a steady pattern of innovations and change, but a lot of traditions continued across well, actually we looked at a dozen of the 15 floors, so across a dozen generations. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And might that have been like I guess the same family? Like, just did the house kind of getting passed through from parent to child?
Yeah, no, the one thing we haven't sorted out yet, clearly they're passing on traditions.
Yeah.
But what we don't know is to what degree outsiders are coming in and living with the family.
Mm.
If they have a demographic crisis, let's say they lost somebody or lost a family and they need new producers in the house.
Yeah.
Did they attract another family into the house from another house or another village or what? And that's the thing, we're kind of scratching our heads and trying to figure out, how do you tease that out of the archaeological record?
That's always the question.
Right, so we're working on that. We now know there is this inherited tradition across a dozen generations.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have to sort of dig into it a little deeper and see if we can sort out the question of interfamily variability within floors and between floors. And it's the rare archaeological context where you can actually do that across a dozen generations.
Yeah, I guess it helps that you just have so many distinct floors that you can just kind of look through. That is fantastic. All right, yeah, well, I think that's all the questions I can think to ask of you.
Okay.
Again, just a fascinating subject, and no doubt there's so much that could be said about it. But I don't want I don't want to keep you for hours.
Well, it's lovely. It's very lovely talking to you, and I'm glad. Thank you for inviting me to do this, and I hope it's informative to your student colleagues.
Yeah, no, I think they'll really enjoy it, because like I said, this is just something that we would never get in any of our classes, because it's so far out of the our area of study, and really a lot of Irish students here just don't really don't know a whole lot about the history or the prehistory of the Americas, and I even don't know a whole lot about that, and I'm American, but that's kind of a very
Sure.
cool system. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me. It's been fantastic.
You're
And
welcome. If you need me to send you any other resources, let me know.
yeah, no, I mean, maybe some pictures of those rocks because they're just really cool. Yeah,
I'll see what I have.
yeah, no, but again, thank
Okay,
you
well,
so much.
okay. You're very welcome.
Have Trowel, Will Travel is produced by the NUIG Archaeology Society. If you enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listened. If you want to stay updated on the Society's activities, you can join our Facebook group, follow us on Instagram, or sign up for email updates at our blog, the links for which can be found in the show notes. If you're a student of NUIG, make sure to join the Society via Yearspace. The Society would like to thank Dr. Prentiss for taking the time to chat with us. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you in the next episode.